and welcome to the 223rd edition of Valley Faith in Action. Thank you for joining us. Whether it's Thanksgiving or Christmas or Easter or the 4th of July, any time of year, are we truly, really, truly thankful for the country that we live in today? Or can we too easily take it for granted? Let's be specific. Have you ever wondered what makes America different from every other nation in the world? What some refer to as American exceptionalism? Is it just because we are wealthier than other nations or more powerful? Or is it something more spiritual? What about our history? Have you ever wondered what America would be like if the very first settlers had come from a different part of the world? Let's say from Asia or Africa or Latin America. Or what if they had come 200 years earlier, before the Reformation? Have you ever wondered what the Pilgrims, the Puritans, the Black Regiment of early pastors, the Founding Fathers did to build the America that we enjoy today? Or did it just evolve? Were these people just a bunch of dead white men that we would rather forget? Or do we really owe them a debt of gratitude? And for what? Have you also wondered what America would be like today if our forefathers had not pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to win our freedom in the 18th century? Or fought to end slavery and to keep our nation together in the 19th century? Or to protect us from tyrants and global terrorists in the 20th and into the 21st centuries? Do you also wonder what people mean when they refer to America as a Christian nation? And do you also wonder whether Americans can still be called a Christian nation today? And what kind of country we will be tomorrow? Finally, do you wonder what can we do to keep and to protect and to promote our Christian heritage for our children and our children's children? I'm Dean Welty, Director of the Valley Family Forum, and our subject, as you might expect, is giving thanks for our godly heritage. Our guest is Stephen McDowell. He is president of the Providence Foundation in Charlottesville, which he helped found in 1984. He is also president of the Foundation's Biblical Worldview University, which trains leaders around the world to transform their culture and their countries for Christ. Mr. McDowell has authored numerous books, videos, and training courses on America's Christian history and on the need for us to live by biblical principles in order to continue to prosper as a culture and as a country. This is his second appearance on Valley Faith in Action. Stephen, welcome back.
Well, it's good to be with you again, Dean.
All the way from Charlottesville. Stephen, I think we ought to first start. What is the Providence Foundation? How did it get started? And why did you get involved?
Well, the mission of the Providence Foundation is to train and network leaders to transform their culture for Christ. And we do that by educating people in biblical principles of law, government, education, economics. In other words, how does the Bible apply, not just personally, but to influencing society around us? As you know, you mentioned, it's been about 27 years ago I helped found the foundation because I looked around at the nation and I recognized there's problems here.
1984. Problems in 1984?
Yeah, we had problems then, but I'd also been introduced to the history of America, the Christian history. Now, I wasn't taught this in school because God was ignored, as he is today in most of our state school public textbooks. Yes. But I began to read, and I thought, here it were that Christians gave birth to this nation that we don't know about today. They gave birth to the most free and prosperous nation really ever in history, what you mentioned earlier, right. American exceptionalism.
Right.
But for some reason, we weren't aware of this. Christians who gave birth to the nation, wrote the laws and constitutions, started the schools and colleges, had retreated from society, and it seemed there was a whole different group of people who did not adhere to the Christian principles that were running things. And I began to see something has to be done. And so this then, my little part in helping to awaken the American people and teach them truth was to help start this organization so that we could equip people and see our nation turn back to God and other nations as well.
Why is that important?
Well, obviously, part of our commission as Christians, Jesus said, go and make disciples of all the nations, which begins by transforming men, but doesn't end there. Because Christ is our Redeemer, and He's given us a commission to transform men, but Christ is also our Creator. And He's given us a commission from the very beginning to transform nations, to influence culture, to take dominion over the earth, to extend His truth into every sphere of life. So it's the central message of the Christian life.
You mentioned that you were first introduced to this Christian history in around 1984. How did that happen?
Well, it was actually many years before that.
Okay.
It was as a new believer in 1977, I think.
Okay.
I read The Light and the Glory by Peter Marshall.
Yes.
I read some things from Francis Schaeffer.
Yes.
And most importantly, I began to read a lot of the primary source documents of early Americans, a lot of sermons that ministers used to preach, and some of the writings, not just religious writings, but political writings that were written by our founding fathers. And I began to recognize these ideas that are contained in the Bible are what they look to build not only their churches and their families, but to build the nation, to build our civil institutions and our economic institutions. Because, as you know, ideas have consequences.
They do indeed. Stephen, we had David Barton here a year ago, and it sounds like both of you are going in the same direction. I imagine you're reading the same documents and coming to the same conclusions.
Well, I've known David for many years, and we've been great friends, and there is much overlap to our work. But if you're looking at the same source, you're going to come up with the same conclusion.
Absolutely.
And then actually we've run across not only Christians, but I've run across academic, writers, professors in history and political science and other places that through their study of primary source documents recognize the same thing. Without God in the Bible, there would be no America as we know it today.
These are even secular historians who aren't looking for this, but in the process, they're discovering it and becoming persuaded that America was founded as a Christian nation? Is that what you're saying?
That's what in the mid-'80s, we visited a professor. He taught at the University of Houston, Dr. Donald Lutz, in the political science department. And he, had gone and gotten his doctorate at Notre Dame and learned the things that they teach in our secular schools today. But he was doing a study as a professor teaching. He wanted to find out what was the origin of America's unique law system, because it's the greatest law system the world has seen that produced the most free and prosperous nation ever. So he wanted to trace back the roots.
Yes.
And so as he told us, he said, one day I kind of came to, in one hand I had the Bible, in the other hand I had Calvin's Institutes of the Christian religion. He said, here is the source of America's civil law.
Yes.
Not their theological ideas, but the civil law. Now, we'd been teaching that for years.
Yes.
But it's just, this is what history proclaims. This is just the facts.
And what did his study produce? What conclusions did he come to? Because he also mentioned covenants. He also mentioned the sources that the Founding Fathers most often quoted.
That's exactly right. In many of the political documents and writings and different things, he put forth different aspects of his discoveries, but one of those dealt with the relative influence of the Enlightenment thinkers on developing the political ideas of the Founding Fathers of America.
Yes.
And he went through and looked at the sources that they acknowledged as where they got their political ideas. And he concluded the most quoted source from 1760 to 1805 for their political ideas, way more than any other, was the Bible. 34% of all
34%.
citations.
It is fascinating, and the next three were also Christian thinkers:
Biblical
Montesquieu, Locke, and Blackstone.
Exactly right. In fact, about 85% of the ideas that influenced our foundings of America were directly from the Bible or were biblical thinkers.
Well, and that really brings us to a question. I want to get to a book that you wrote about America's providential history, but before we get to that, if that was what influenced our founding fathers, that is the Bible and biblically informed scholars, can we conclude that our founding fathers were Christians, or that they simply had a biblical worldview, or how do you square that?
Well, or you might be asking the question, was America a Christian nation?
That's right.
Now, when I answer that, I first say, well, first you have to define what you mean by a Christian nation.
Yes.
America was not an ecclesiastical nation where the church ruled like they had in Europe. The founders of America, many of them fled to America to escape the tyranny from a state-mandated religion.
But they didn't leave their own faith behind. They brought it with them.
They certainly did. So
the Puritans and the Pilgrims.
Yeah, we did not have a state establishment with an official church. So that's not how I would define a Christian nation. A Christian nation is also not one where 100% of the population is Christian. We'll probably never see a nation on this side of Christ's second return where that's the case. But it's not also necessarily a nation where a majority are Christian, just over 50%. Well, that would be a good start. The way I define it, and I believe the founders, when they referred to America as a Christian nation, what they were looking to is that the source of the ideas upon which the nation are founded are rooted in the Scripture. Every nation is built upon a set of ideas or principles that are ultimately rooted in the faith of the people. That's why all nations are religious. It's easy to show that America was founded upon biblical principles.
In the same way that we will refer to a Jewish nation or a Muslim nation, we refer to America as a Christian nation. The same principles.
That's right. See, here's a fundamental question every society should be asking, and none are, and that is, who is the source of the law of the society?
Yes.
It's fundamental because the source of the law of a society, whether that be civil law or your own personal moral law, is the God of that society.
Yes.
In early America, the source of our law was the Bible. All you have to do is read the early charters, laws. There were about over 100 different constitutions, compacts, and laws written in early America from the colonial period. And when you read through those, you see time and again they acknowledge God, Jesus Christ. They covenant together under Him. They reveal He is the supreme authority, and they say that we're looking to His Word, and if there's any neglect, the Bible is the standard by which we're going to judge. So we certainly were founded as a Christian nation in the sense we look to God as the source of what was right and wrong, what was moral or immoral, what was a civil standard of conduct and behavior. It's easy to show. Now, today, so the fact that we were a Christian nation is easy.
Yes.
If you define it that way. In fact, our founders referred to us as a Christian nation over and over.
Yes. And the Supreme Court in 1892.
The Supreme Court ruled that in 1892. Even scientists wrote about it, like Matthew Fontaine Maury. We are a Christian nation.
Right.
So we certainly were. The question is, are we still today? Because some would say, okay, I acknowledge you were birthed as a Christian nation, but we no longer are. We are now a pluralistic society where we have different faiths and some who don't believe at all. We're not Christian anymore. Well, and we have been shifting from that biblical base to a humanistic base, a secular society where we don't look to God in His absolutes for what's right or wrong. We now look to man, the consensus of man, and we have declared we will decide ourselves what's right or wrong, what's moral or immoral. So we are doing that today, unfortunately, especially through some of our radical courts and judges in their decision. But in many places, we still look to the absolutes of God. We have many civil laws that form the standard based upon God's higher law. Gradually, we've been shifting to that. And anytime you change from one law base to another, you change God's.
Yes,
and
you
that's
do.
what we've been doing. That's why, the work of the Providence Foundation and
Yes.
ministries like that are so vital, so that
Yes.
we can say, no, we don't want to go this way,
Right.
because the consequences of looking to man as his own God, we've known many examples throughout history where it leads to destruction.
It leads to tyranny because there is no absolute law. There was no king in Israel. Everybody did what was right in his own eyes. The government becomes king, the government of men. They decide what your freedoms are going to be and what they're not going to be. Tyranny or chaos, it leads to chaos. Chaos always leads to tyranny and
exactly
despotism.
right. Yeah.
And that's the direction that you see America heading today. So it's open to question, do we still define America as a Christian nation? Yes, in its foundations, but in its direction, we're not quite sure.
And let me add one thing here. When people say, well, today we're pluralistic, it's very important for us to realize there's no such thing as pluralism except in a Christian nation. There is no liberty to worship Christianity in Muslim nations.
That's right.
There's no liberty in atheistic nations for men to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. In history, it's only been the Christian nation of America that has allowed individuals to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. And if those people who want to kick God out of public life and get him off our money and kick him out of our schools, if they succeed, they are actually slitting their own throat, because they're removing the very foundation, the Christian religion, that gave birth to the liberty that they have to stand up and attack God now.
If you remove Christian liberty, you're removing all your liberties, and it's open to somebody else to determine what you may and may not do, and your liberty is down the tubes.
And if you are a Christian and believe in absolutes, you're at the top of the line of being dispendable and getting out of here.
Stephen, I just want to show our viewers one of the books that you've written that addresses this question, America, a Christian Nation, and I think you've pretty well given your answer to that. Let's go now to we've talked about the Founding Fathers and their Christian faith and their biblical worldview. What about our founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? Do you find these biblical principles embodied in those documents?
Without a doubt. Both the power and the form of our Declaration and Constitution are biblical. Well, what do I mean by that? The form is the external framework of the type of government that our founders gave us. It was unique. There's no nation like it. We are an American Christian constitutional federal republic. Each one of those has a meaning. But what they did is they recognized, when they saw man the way God sees man, as fallen, sinful individual, and you can't entrust too much power to him. Therefore,
it sounds like Jeremiah. The heart is wicked and deceitful.
They spoke of that, the founders, many times. So they said, when we set up a government, we need to limit man's power.
Yes.
Even Christian man, because they have the tendency to abuse a power.
And how did they do that?
Well, one, we have a government of laws, constitutionalism.
Yes.
Throughout most of history, most men have lived under rulers' law. The rulers made the law, imposed them on the people. They had no choice. In America, people covenanted together under God and formulated their own law.
And wrote it down.
Wrote it down.
Right.
Jefferson said, Constitution acts like a chain to bind down the power of men. Another way was to separate powers. That every government executes three functions: a legislative function, lawmaking; executive carries out the law; and judicial, it interprets the law. Now, God can do all three. In fact, Isaiah 33:22 says, "The Lord is King, the Lord is Judge, the Lord is our lawgiver."
Yes.
He will save us.
Yes.
But He's perfect.
That's why we're one nation under God.
Yeah, but man is not, so you need to separate. This is where Montesquieu, that French political philosopher, his writing was very influential in America's thinking, because anytime he said, if you combine these three functions under one or a few people, the result is tyranny.
Yes.
So you need to separate them, have a series of checks and balances to keep men from abusing authority. So that was another important function. Then you had election of representatives. You need to hold our representatives accountable, because if they're going to go and make laws, and if they make them contrary to the God's moral standard, then we need to kick them out and replace them with someone who would reflect that.
But you don't see democracy mentioned in the Bible.
Well, I see actually, it's interesting that that in our books we write about the framework.
Yes.
And we give 7 pillars that were unique to America's form of government, and all of these have the principles rooted in the Bible.
Okay.
A representative government, it was rooted in the Bible, where the people chose from among themselves, and Moses affirmed their choice.
Right.
So there was a consent of the governed, where the king only ruled according to their agreement to that.
What about separation of church and state? Is that biblical?
Without a doubt, because you see that when a couple of kings, Jeroboam or was it Rehoboam, tried to perform the function of the priest, God didn't like that at all. So there was a jurisdictional separation.
Saul did that. King Uzziah did that. And they paid the penalty for having usurped the role of the church.
Yeah, so the concept of separation of church and state, which was really, that term was not used by our founders. Jefferson used it once in a letter, but even when he used it, his concept was there is a jurisdictional separation of the institution of civil government with the institution of the church. They should be kept separate so that the state should not usurp the authority of the church, nor should the church attempt to do what God commissioned the civil government to do. So those institutions needed to be separated. But that doesn't mean you separate God from government. This is an impossibility because God is sovereign over all government. He created it. How can you separate Him from that institution?
How about the Declaration of Independence? Is there any reference to Judeo-Christian values and beliefs in the Declaration?
Well, it throughout that whole document, it does. Now, some obvious things where they appeal to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of their intentions, with a firm reliance upon the protection of divine providence. But it also in the beginning mentions the Creator, that we are endowed. It says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights summarized by life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Creator was not a big bang.
So they recognize God as our Creator is the source of our liberties and rights. And that if they emanate from government or man, we're in big trouble because government or man can take them away.
In fact, it calls on us to alter or to abolish any government that is destructive of those God-endowed rights.
That's right.
Was there another reference to God in the Declaration?
Well, let me back up here. So we hold these truths to be self-evident. This is something that made the American nation, that covenant, strong, because there was a set of truths that the people adhered to, about which they could form a nation. And the only reason they were self-evident is because they emanated from the Christian worldview that caused them, in the heart and conscience of man, more specifically in the written Word of God, to be knowledgeable and known. I have a friend, he's from India. He's kind of like the Francis Schaeffer of India. So he points out to me, Eastern philosophies do not have self-evident truths because they have a different worldview. These truths that the founders gave us in the Declaration of Independence in our documents are not self-evident to a non-Christian people. They're only self-evident to a people who have been influenced by the truth of God, that they recognize we have a right to life, we have a right to liberty. We have a right to property, both internal and external property. We have a right to set up our own governments, to protect these God-given rights and abolish them when they don't fulfill those purposes.
That's right. Just 2 more questions. There's also the reference to the laws of nature and of nature's God.
You're exactly right. And that phrase that Jefferson used was a well-established phrase. He didn't invent it. It had been there a long time. And it's easy to show the law of nature is the revelation of God in creation and in the conscience of men, as spoken of in Romans 1 and 2, Psalm 19, and other places. But, and it goes on to say, then the law of nature's God is the specific revelation of God in the Holy Scriptures. So we're talking about general revelation through the natural world and the special revelation that God gives us through Scripture. And we need both because all men are created in the image of God. Even the unredeemed, they have some knowledge of what's right and wrong. But that knowledge is limited because of his fallen state. That's why God in His mercy gave to man a written law so that it would be clear.
Stephen, we only have a couple of minutes, so I want you to just give us a word about this other book, America's Providential History, suggesting that God actually guided the development of America.
Yeah, this is our best-selling book. It's been out for over 2 decades, America's Providential History. I love the picture of George Washington on the cover in prayer at Valley Forge. But the premise of this book is that God is the author of history.
Yes.
If you believe
His story.
It's His story. If you believe God is sovereign, which is a basic belief of the Christian faith, then you have to believe He's directing history. History is a revelation of God's plan and purpose for man. From creation to the present, God has been at work using both the godly and ungodly to advance His purpose, which basically is to bring liberty to man, both internal and external liberty.
And in that book, you cite specific instances. Now, we don't have time to go into that, but specific instances where you see God's hand directing the development of America. Could you give us one of the most prominent?
Well, there's so many. I love the story of George Washington, because George Washington epitomizes the American Christian Constitutional Republic.
Right.
But he was a man of providence who recognized God's hand on his life, and he spoke of it over and over and over. In fact, in 1778, looking back over the first 3 years of the war, he wrote that any man who does not recognize the hand of providence in these events is worse than an infidel that lacks faith and more than wicked.
Yes. If you don't see it, God have mercy on your soul. Stephen, just one last question. You talked about the trends in America today. Ben Franklin, when he looked at the back of George Washington's chair at the end of the Constitutional Convention, said, "I've often wondered whether that sun is rising or setting on America." We're going to bring you back for one more segment of this. But just in brief, do you see the sun rising or setting on America today?
Well, I have hope for many reasons, because I think God is awakening His people. We see it in the increase in people homeschooling their children, taking responsibility to train the next generation. We see many Christians rising up with organizations like the Family Foundation who are concerned with restoring morality and God's standard to our society all over the United States in the past 20, 30 years. More and more have been springing up. So there is reason to hope.
You see the sun rising.
But there's a lot of challenges.
Well, we're going to talk about that in our next segment. So we're going to invite our viewers to join us again next week when Stephen McDowell is going to be with us, talking about Watchmen on the Wall for God and Country. Well, Stephen, thank you again for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Again, if you want to know more about the Valley Family Forum, just go to our website, valleyfamilyforum.org. You can help support the programs with a tax-deductible gift. Send it to the address shown on your screen. Again, thank you for being with us. I'm Dean Welty, inviting you to join us again next week when Stephen McDowell will be talking with us about Watchmen on the Wall for God and Country. Until then, have a great week putting your faith into action.